Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
So today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting.
Yeah.
It's this idea of trusting God even more,
Hmm.
and how he kind of invites us to do that,
Right.
even when it doesn't make sense.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be looking at a story from Exodus,
Okay.
um, the Israelites at the Red Sea.
Oh, yeah.
And, they had seen all these miracles already.
Yeah, God's power on full display,
Those
right?
plagues, the Passover.
They'd seen it all.
Like, you think their faith would be...
Unshakable,
Yeah.
you would think.
But then they come up to this new challenge, and doubt just creeps right back in.
Yeah. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Have you ever felt like that? Like God's asking you to trust him, but it just doesn't add up.
Oh, yeah. All the time.
Yeah. So that's what we're going to unpack today.
I'm excited.
Some signs that God might be calling us to trust him more.
Awesome. Let's do it.
So to start off, I want to ask you about the context.
Okay.
Like, what was going on with the Israelites at this point?
So they were fleeing oppression, you know? They were on their way to the promised land.
Freedom.
Exactly. Freedom was on the horizon, but
They'd just seen the Nile turn to blood.
can you imagine?
I can't.
They had experienced those terrifying
You've
plagues.
seen God protect them during the Passover?
Yeah, they had front row seats to God's power.
Like, seriously, you'd think they'd be good to go on the faith front.
You'd think so, right?
But then
Yeah.
God tells them something crazy.
What's that?
Turn
Oh,
back
that.
to Egypt
What?
and camp by the Red Sea.
Oh, no.
Can you imagine their faces?
Like what?
They're thinking they're on the road to freedom,
finally escaping.
and then boom, they got to go back towards their oppressors.
It's like finally escaping that traffic jam, only to end up right back in it.
Ugh, the worst.
The worst.
So is this like the first sign?
Boom.
May God's inviting us to trust him more
Okay. I like that.
when his instructions just don't make sense?
Right. It's like
Yeah.
he's saying, trust me, even when it doesn't make sense to you. Exactly.
It's that leap of faith.
Oh, like Kierkegaard talked about.
Sure.
Stepping outside of reason and logic.
Right. Believing in what we can't see.
So the Israelites, they couldn't fathom how camping by the Red Sea would save them.
No way.
But is it dangerous to just blindly obey?
That's a great question.
Like, how do we know it's God's voice and not just us?
Yeah, you don't want to just follow any voice you hear.
Right.
I think it takes a deep relationship with God to know his voice.
So, like, knowing his character and studying the Bible.
Yeah. And being sensitive to the Holy Spirit.
But for the Israelites, they had a history with God, right?
They did.
They'd seen him be faithful.
Over and over again.
So it's like the more we see someone be trustworthy,
The easier it is to trust them.
even when we don't get it.
Exactly.
So their past was kind of preparing them for this.
Yeah, like a training ground for trust.
So we got illogical instructions.
Yeah.
Now what's the second sign?
Okay, so the second sign is facing the impossible.
Okay.
They weren't just told to camp by the Red Sea. They were told to face it.
Why?
Like, why that detail?
It seems kind of mean, right?
Yeah, like making them stare down this huge obstacle.
Like a giant wall of water.
But it's about perspective.
Okay.
God often lets us confront the impossible.
I guess so. We realize our limits.
Yeah, it's in those moments when we're totally helpless.
That we can see God's power.
Like, imagine them,
The waves crashing.
the vastness of the sea,
They needed a miracle.
big time.
It's like reading about a hurricane versus being in one.
Oh, yeah, totally different.
You realize how powerful nature is,
You see your own weakness.
and you recognize a power bigger than yourself.
Exactly.
That's what God was doing,
I think so.
preparing them for a miracle.
A miracle they'd never forget.
One that would make their faith strong.
For generations to come.
So we got illogical instructions,
Check.
facing the impossible. But
Right.
did they actually do it?
Did they trust God?
That's the big
The
question.
call to obey.
That's sign number 3. Exodus 14.2 says, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They did it,
They obeyed.
even though it makes zero sense.
That's trust,
Putting faith into action,
even when you're full of doubt,
it's like surrendering your logic.
and stepping into God's power.
Beautiful, isn't it?
So those three signs,
Illogical instructions,
facing the impossible,
and the call to obey.
they're all chances to trust God more.
Absolutely.
But what about our lives?
Yeah, good point.
We don't see Red Seas every day.
Not literally.
So what does this story mean for us?
Well, I think the Red Sea represents any obstacle that seems impossible.
Yep.
Any situation that makes us afraid and doubtful.
So like our Red Sea could be a job change.
Oh, yeah.
Or a relationship that's falling apart.
Absolutely.
Even like a personal struggle.
Any situation where you feel stuck.
With no way out.
Yeah, when it seems like nothing you do can fix it.
And we just want to rely on ourselves.
Our own logic.
But the Red Sea story reminds us that God...
He works differently.
Yeah. So how do we see those trust invitations in our
Here
lives?
you go. Good question.
Like, what are the clues that God's calling us to trust him more?
Even when it feels impossible.
Exactly.
Well, it could be a feeling in your heart.
Like a whisper.
Yeah, a sense that something needs to change.
Like a longing for something more.
Exactly. Or maybe it's a recurring thought.
Oh, yeah.
A dream that you can't shake.
Or a situation that's just spiraling.
And you can't control it.
No matter what you do.
It's like God's getting your attention.
Okay, so we sense that nudge.
That invitation.
But then the fear comes in.
Uh-oh.
What if I make the wrong choice?
Yeah, what if I mess up?
How do we get past that
That's the big question.
and take that leap of faith?
Well, remember, the Israelites were scared too.
They complained to Moses.
Didn't they?
Like, why did you bring us here to die?
Fear is natural.
Especially when you don't know what's going to happen.
It's how we're wired.
But fear doesn't cancel out faith.
It actually shows us where we need to trust God more.
So it's not about not being afraid.
It's about trusting God even when you are.
But how...
How do we do that?
Yeah, it's easy to say just trust God.
Right.
But when you're in the middle of it,
When the doubts are screaming,
it's hard.
one thing that helps me is remembering how God's been faithful.
Oh, yeah.
Think about those times when he came through for you.
Write them down.
Yes.
Make a list of all those times.
Gotta live those stories.
Let them build your faith.
It's like making a case for trusting God.
Yes.
Gathering evidence.
From our own lives.
Every answered prayer.
Every breakthrough.
It all points to his faithfulness.
And when we remember those things,
our faith gets stronger.
like a muscle.
Exactly.
So we remember God's been good to us.
We admit we're scared.
And then what?
How do we know what to do?
Yeah, we don't have burning bushes telling us.
Right, not usually.
So how do we hear God?
Well, he speaks in lots of ways.
Oh.
Through the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
through wise people,
Okay.
even through the situation itself.
So we got to be listening, paying
That's right,
attention
Lord.
to those little nudges.
The whispers.
So being close to God.
That's how we learn to hear him.
And then the fear doesn't control us,
It's still there.
but it doesn't have the same power
We have peace
because we know God's with us.
through it all.
But what about blind obedience?
Oh, that's a good point.
How do we know it's not just us
Wanting what we want,
and calling it God's will?
that's where discernment comes in.
Okay.
Check your promptings against the Bible.
Like, is this how God acts?
Does it line up with his love and justice?
And does it produce good fruit?
Talking to wise people can help too.
Get advice from people you trust.
People who know God.
Okay, so we check our motives
We get advice.
and we make sure it lines up with God's character.
That's a good start.
But what if we think we're following God?
And things still go wrong.
What if the Red Sea doesn't part?
That's when trust is really tested.
Yeah.
It's okay to question God.
Really?
Tell him your doubts.
Your pain.
Your confusion.
Like the Psalms.
Yeah.
Full of people crying out to God.
Feeling abandoned.
But even then,
They still believed God was good,
they held on to that.
even when they didn't understand.
And sometimes it's in those hard times
When we've lost everything.
that we see God's grace the most.
Like we have to let go of our own ideas
Our own
to
expectations.
really see how big God's love is.
And sometimes the miracle isn't what we thought.
It's how we change on the inside.
So trusting God isn't about avoiding hard stuff.
Or always being successful.
It's about surrendering to his plan.
Even when it's confusing.
And that's where we find freedom
Freedom from our circumstances.
and peace.
Peace that nothing can shake.
So insightful.
Thank you.
But I'm wondering, how do we actually do this?
Put this into practice.
Yeah. How do we trust God more every day?
It starts small. What's one thing God's been telling you to do?
But you've been putting it off.
Because you're scared.
Or you have doubts. Like maybe it's calling that friend you've been avoiding.
Oh.
Or starting that project you've been dreaming about.
Or just being quiet and listening to God.
In the stillness.
Exactly. Just take that step.
It doesn't have to be huge.
Just one little act of obedience.
And God will meet us there.
He'll give you the strength you need.
So we don't wait for the fear to go away.
We trust God even when we're afraid.
And the more we do that,
The more we grow.
the impossible starts to seem possible.
And those red seas in our lives,
Those huge obstacles.
they become chances to see God's power.
This has been amazing.
I'm glad.
I'm seeing trust in a whole new way.
How so?
It's not about not having doubts.
right?
It's about choosing to believe in God.
Even when we don't understand.
That's the beauty of it. We don't need all the answers.
It's faith.
We embrace the mystery,
We walk with God.
knowing he's with us.
Always.
So any last words of wisdom?
Think about the Red Sea. What's your Red Sea right now?
What feels impossible?
Could it be that God's inviting you to trust him more?
In a way that will change everything.
Maybe even change you.
Don't run from those invitations.
Embrace them.
Even if it's uncomfortable.
Use to trust.
Even when it's hard.
You might just see a miracle.
And remember, you're not alone.
God is with you.
Every step of the way.
He's guiding you.
And giving you strength.
To do amazing things.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
We hope you learned something about trusting God.
And that you're feeling encouraged.
Until next time.
See ya then.
Keep seeking God.
And trusting him.
He's got